I used to live in the middle of backwoods Pennsylvania, near a set of train tracks that ran through the woods. About once, maybe twice a week, I would hear the cry of a train horn splitting the air, always at a different time, but usually in the early morning or late evening. Sometimes it would even wake me from a dead sleep in the middle of the night. The little house I was renting was nice, at the very end of the cul-de-sac I lived in, and nestled back against a copse of trees. I wasn't entirely sure where the train tracks were, since they didn't run through town anywhere, but every time I was startled by the piercing cry, I thought it sounded like it was coming from the woods. The longer I lived in that little house, the more curious I got about the train. It probably sounds silly, but I've always liked trains, and even though I found the train horn startling, it was comforting in a weird way too. Every time it sounded, my ears would perk up, and I would find myself tracing the sound as it moved, trying to pinpoint exactly where it came from, and where it was going to. Finally, after about a year of that, I decided to take one of my days off and go look for the train tracks. I put a few bottles of water and some snacks in a backpack, put on my favorite pair of walking shoes, and practically skipped out the front door. It reminded me of being a kid. I didn't have the best home life, so it wasn't uncommon for me to pack a bag with enough provisions and comic books for the day before disappearing into the woods near our house. The woods were my escape, a place where I was safe from anger, yelling, and whatever my parents were throwing at each other that day. The forest was always calm and quiet. It made me feel safe, a feeling I couldn't always get at home. As I walked out my back door, I was reminded of that, and how much I loved going for those walks as a kid. I'll admit, I think I was expecting it to feel just as safe and magical now. But oh, how wrong I was. The forest itself was perfect. Silence punctuated only by the occasional bird call or rustle of the leaves brushing each other in the wind. It was an early spring day, and the earth was spongy from recent rainfall. Dew dripped lazily from the green trees and sparkled on the tall grass as I walked through it. I made my way in the approximate direction I'd heard the train horn coming from. No real plan in mind for when I found it, just enjoying the breeze as it played with my hair. After about an hour, I finally found the train tracks, and let out an excited whoop when they came into view. I raced forward like a little kid until I got right next to them, and I began walking parallel to the tracks, towards the mountains in the distance. My parents had always told me not to walk near train tracks. I always wanted to follow them just once to see where I wound up. I followed the train tracks with a spring in my step, not noticing the sun sinking lower in the sky until the shadows grew long enough in front of me to blend together into one big pool of shadow. When I realized the sun was starting to go down, I stopped. I had been so lost in my thoughts and in finally fulfilling a childhood dream that I hadn't realized how late it was. I turned around and followed the train tracks, now at a quicker pace, until I reached the area I thought I had started from. I was still following the tracks when a figure emerged from the twilight on the path in front of me. I couldn't make out any details, but it seemed to be entirely gray, like a smudge of ash on the horizon growing steadily larger. Something about it really unsettled me, which I attributed to being a woman walking alone at night and seeing a stranger approach in the twilight. I veered off the tracks and made my way through the woods, emerging one neighborhood over from my own, and followed the streets back to my house, exhausted by the time I finally got there. I guess the stranger I saw on the tracks just left my mind. I didn't think about it at all for the rest of the night, and by the time I woke up the next day, I didn't even remember the vaguely unsettling encounter. It was a few weeks before I was able to make it back into the woods. But once another lazy day off came around, I packed my bag and escaped out the back door again. This time I left a bit earlier and went the other direction, towards what I assumed would be town, or maybe the next town over. I figured if I wandered to the next town by accident, I could always take a taxi home. This was before Uber was very popular. This time, I took a can of spray paint and made a huge blue X on one of the trees that I could see from the tracks, so I would know when to head back into the woods to get home. I can't say for sure, but that decision might have saved my life. Again, time seemed to escape me, and before I knew it, it was late afternoon. I turned myself around, and once again saw a smudge on the distant horizon, slowly approaching me and taking shape. This time there was enough light that I assumed it would be fine. Probably just another person wandering the train tracks to fill their empty Sunday afternoon. I kept walking, studying the trees surrounding the tracks on either side, and admiring the giant purple mountains in front of me. I was startled from my reverie to realize that what had been nothing more than a smudge the last time I looked was now a person, just a few hundred yards away at most. I studied him as he approached. He seemed to be wearing a gray three-piece suit and gray shoes. His hair was gray too. He carried some kind of bag. It looks like a white trash bag, like one of the really heavy-duty ones, and it almost looked like it was filled with a liquid. It heaved and sagged, even though he carried it with such ease it could have been full of helium. I'll admit, I didn't find him terrifying at first. It was a lovely afternoon. I was enjoying myself, and I've always been a really friendly person, so I was actually kind of excited that I might get to meet one of my neighbors out on my little walk. But when we were close enough for me to greet him, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like all my senses shut down, and the only thing I was left with was this awful feeling of complete and total revulsion. Despite my vision going gray around the edges, I forced myself to keep walking, to get past the mystery person and closer to home. When we were right next to each other, all my senses returned to normal, and I noticed with a pang of fear and concern that even the man's skin was an ashy shade of gray. He continued to face forward, but his face seemed to melt and twist in my direction. All the features remained clear, but it was like the skin behind his face was melting, allowing the face itself to slip in my direction. He smiled at me, flashing gray teeth, and the corner of a great tongue peeking out of his mouth. Then he passed me and I took a huge gulp of air, trying to calm my rioting stomach and nerves. Despite how badly I wanted to collapse to the earth and sob from whatever the hell that was, I forced myself to keep walking. Now more than ever I just wanted to get home. After a few more minutes of walking, I managed to convince myself I had just imagined it. Or maybe the man had some kind of medical condition, and I was being unfair to judge him so harshly. As I successfully guilt-tripped myself into brushing off the weirdness, I noticed something on the horizon, a gray smudge that seemed to be getting closer to me. I debated it for a moment, and allowed myself to stop and turn around. There was nothing behind me, no traces of the strange gray man. I turned back around, and somehow he had managed to clear almost all the distance between us and the time it took me to turn around and back. I forced myself to keep walking, insisting to my now terrified brain that it was a coincidence, or I had spaced out for longer than I realized. As I got closer to the man, I forced a smile onto my own face, and with every ounce of courage I had asked, "Hey there, didn't we just see each other?" The look on his face didn't alter in the slightest, and neither did his stride as he approached. His mouth opened, and a voice as gray as a tombstone said, "We'll be seeing a lot of each other." The smile on his face stayed in place as mine faltered and crashed, and I picked up my pace to get past him as quickly as possible. As I did, a scent I hadn't noticed before wafted from his trash bag to my nose, and I had to resist the need. It was more than an urge to vomit. What I smelled can only be described as death. Plain and simple. It assaulted my nostrils and filled my mind with images of death and destruction, things I never could have pictured on my own. War-torn battlefields scattered with the flesh and blood of innocent people, bodies torn apart by animals, corpses swaying in the breeze, glassy eyes still begging for a savior even though it was far too late. I gasped, pressing my hands to my mouth and nose, and hurried away. After a few minutes the smell was gone, but the images and nausea remained. I couldn't understand what was wrong with me, and more than anything I just wanted to get home, to safety and my comfy-ass chair. But I was still at least an hour away from my house. I glanced behind me again, let out a sigh of relief when I saw the gray man still walking away from me, and bit my tongue so hard I drew blood when I turned back and saw another gray smudge on the horizon. I whipped my head around again, and saw he had disappeared. With resignation to my fate, I turned back around already knowing what would be in front of me. Sure enough, the gray man with the gray smile was once again a few hundred yards in front of me. I bit back a little sob, and looked around, wondering if I could get away from him somehow. Most of the area between the tracks and the trees was filled with grass and weeds that would go up at least to my waist. I would have been fine with that, except I'm terrified of ticks, and didn't want to risk taking one home with me. As the stranger approached in the distance, I weighed my options. Past the creepy old guy again, or risk getting a parasite. It was a hard choice, and I finally took a deep breath and plunged into the tall grass. I glanced over at the tracks, almost against my will, and breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't there. He must have done his little disappearing trick when I stepped off the tracks. I smiled in relief, and faced front again, my heart shattering into violent little shards in my chest as I jumped backwards and to the side. He was directly in front of me again, with that same carved from stone, gray-toothed smile, He continued walking forward, eyes on the horizon, fist clenched around the trash bag in his hand. I stopped moving and simply stared at him as he passed, begging my mind to make sense of what was happening. Something in the bag sloshed, and the smell of blood and death overwhelmed me, making me feel sick all over again. I pressed my hands into my eyes, but when I opened them, the gray man was still there, walking away from me, his pace the same as ever. I forced myself to root to the spot and watch him walk away. I waited until the shadows grew longer and he was once again just a gray smudge on the horizon. When I turned back around, I was angry but not surprised to see the gray smear in front of me again. I sighed and continued walking, telling myself it was a coincidence, or I was imagining things. But as he came back into focus, a distant part of my mind screamed that I was in danger. I made the mistake of shoving that voice and its wisdom to the back of my mind. I had to get home. I didn't want to walk in the tall grass and risk getting a tick. And the gray man was going to be there no matter what I did, so I might as well follow the tracks until I made it back home. This time when the gray man got closer, the smell was the first thing that greeted me. I choked down my vomit and blinked tears from my eyes as I took a deep breath and held it. When the man was about 10 feet from me, something in his smile changed. He didn't move exactly, but his lower jaw seemed to groan, as if the hinges of his jaw were melting and allowing his face to sink lower and lower. For the first time his eyes met mine, and I knew I had made a horrible mistake. By the time he passed me, his jaw was down to his chest, but his eyes had never left mine. Once he was behind me, I began sprinting, only interested in getting home before it was completely dark. Up ahead I could just see the bright blue X I had spray painted on the tree, and I veered away from the tracks again, now running through the grass with no other thought in mind when getting back home. But as I ran, my vision began to blur slightly. The shadows of the trees turned gray and seemed to take on more form. Something gray appeared right in front of the tree I had painted on, slowly morphing into a gray man walking towards me, trash bag swinging from his hand. I halted, waited until he was a few feet from me, then bolted to the side, into the tree line. I crashed through the trees wildly, paying attention to nothing except the gray smudges that would appear in front of me, taking shape into the man more rapidly each time. By the time I saw my house in the distance, the gray man was practically running alongside me, smile still carved into his face, bag still swinging in his hand, liquid and whatever else it contained sloshing around inside. I made it inside and locked the doors and windows, but outside I could still see the two pale shadows lurking, taking on the form of a man before disappearing again. I left Pennsylvania and not long after that. It lost all its charm for me, but when I lay down in bed at night, all I can see when I close my eyes is the gray man, off in the distance. He gets closer every night, and I know someday he'll catch me. When I was younger, I was a big fan of urban exploration. My best friend at the time was too, and she knew all the best spots and all the rules for safe exploring. Some of the rules were pretty obvious, with tennis shoes and tall socks. Wear something you can move quickly and freely in. Take a flashlight and a bottle of water. Some of the rules were more subtle. Learn it through years of trial and error. This story is about one of those rules, and how I insisted on learning it the hard way. Nikki, my friend, was and still is one of the smartest people I've ever known, which means she was also the best person for me to get into urban exploring with. Not only did she know all the best places, but I trusted her so completely I would do what she said without argument most of the time. After our adventures exploring an abandoned Macy's, an old barn, and several spur-of-the-moment road trips, Nikki told me there was somewhere special she wanted to go. She wouldn't tell me anything about it until we got there, which was unusual but only made me more excited to see whatever it was. I remember the first time I visited that place with her. It was late summer, when the leaves haven't started to turn yet, but you can feel the first cold spark in the air that promises the seasons are right about to change. One of the things I liked about exploring with Nikki was that she always drove us, so I got to sit in the passenger seat and watch the scenery pass us by. That day we drove out into the hills on the outskirts of town, passing neighborhoods, then houses, then fields with the occasional house, then nothing but trees and hills. I memorized the route we took, some part of me knowing already that I would want to return to this place. I wish I wasn't so good at memorizing directions. We had stopped for coffee before making our way out of town, and we laughed and sang along loudly to the music on the radio as she drove. After a long time, Nikki pulled the car off to the side of the road, parked in an area that had no discernible markers as far as I could tell, and said with a grin, "We're here." I stepped out of the car and breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of tall grass, old-growth trees, and rotting wood. I looked around at the tall pines and lovely aspens, then smiled at Nikki. I said, "All right, I'm not sure this one qualifies as urban exploration, but it's a nice spot." Nikki smirked and tossed her long, curly brown hair over her shoulder. "I guess it's not urban." "No, but you're really going to like this." I followed her as we walked through the woods. There was no path and I wasn't entirely sure there ever had been. It looked and felt like no one had ever been out here except for us. I had a brief moment of fear remembering all those stories about people snapping and sacrificing their friends or classmates to Slender Man, then shook it off. After a few minutes of hiking over dead trees, through tall grass, and past strange detritus, I'm pretty sure I saw an old wagon completely overgrown with weeds. At one point I saw a structure not too far from us, partly obscured by the trees. Nikki pointed to the structure and said, "There it is." Just past a small river, hidden in the line of trees, was a miniature version of an old Victorian house. At one point in time it had been painted pink and blue. The trim around the windows had probably been white, and my inner child fell in love with it instantly. In a hushed, almost reverent tone I asked, "What is it?" Nikki gave me her most pleased smile, the expression she reserved for our best discoveries, and whispered back, "It's an old playhouse. I'm guessing some rich guy had it built for his daughters, ages and ages ago. It's beautiful, in kind of an unsettling way, right?" I nodded. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. There was something about it that made me feel like I would hear children's voices, or see a little girl dart out from behind it at any moment. The playhouse was at least 2 stories from what I could tell, and made of wood and stone rather than plastic. The paint was chipping off, the roof was caving in, and most of the glass windows were broken. I was entranced, and began walking towards it, sure Nikki would know the best way to cross the river to get to it, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me back. All she said was, "No." I laughed. "What do you mean? We came all the way out here, and you don't want to go look at it?" She shook her head, an abnormally serious expression on her usually cheerful face. "We can stay on this side of the river and look at it, but we're not going over there." I chuckled again, but I was starting to get frustrated. "We can wade through the river if there's no bridge or anything. I promise I'll stand right next to your car until I'm dry if you don't have any towels." Nikki had learned it the hard way to always keep a towel in the trunk of her car. She let go of my arm. I took a step back. "Mara, look around. Do you see beer bottles anywhere? Cigarettes? Soda cans? Candy wrappers?" I looked around at the ground, noting in surprise that I didn't see anything of the kind. "No. I guess whoever owns this land maintains it really well." Nikki said, "Nobody maintains it. It's just that no one wants to be out here for very long. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. There's a reason no one wants to get close to that thing. We can admire from a distance, but we don't need to cross the river. Just trust me, okay?" I couldn't. I had always trusted her implicitly, and it had always been a good call. But this time I just couldn't understand why she was refusing to let me look closer at this amazing little discovery. We stood there in the field arguing about it for a few more minutes, until Nikki finally threatened to abandon me there if I took one more step closer to the old playhouse. Of course I had to take another step towards it, and she immediately turned around and started back towards the car, ready to make good on her promise. I laughed and chased after her, saying, "I was kidding. I'm kidding." She kept walking, not stopping until we made it back to the car, and I could tell she wasn't really angry with me. We brushed ourselves off, checked each other for ticks, another rule she learned it the hard way, then got back in the car and went to the mall. When Nikki dropped me off at my house later that day, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I was serious, Mara. If there's no sign of humans around a clearly man-made structure, that's a good sign. You need to be careful." I smiled, but I couldn't meet her eyes as I said, "Yeah, of course. I got you." I could tell she didn't feel good about it, but she went home anyway. I spent the next few weeks thinking about the playhouse nonstop. I had taken a few pictures of it, and I spent all my time looking at them, zooming in and out and studying the structure as if I was going to take a test on it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and on one warm fall Saturday, I got in my car and traced our route back to the old playhouse. It was a lot harder to find alone, and I had to drive back and forth on the road for a while before I found the spot where I thought we had parked the last time. It was mid-afternoon, and the first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was the total lack of sound. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, nothing. I couldn't remember if I had heard animals or not when I came here with Nikki, but I pushed on despite my unease. I walked through the brush and tall grass for a while before I finally saw the playhouse in the distance. I had imagined that scene in my head in the days leading up to it, and I had expected to feel elation. Instead, I felt a vague unease as storm clouds gathered in the distance. I told myself it was just my brain fooling me, because of the storm clouds, and pushed on. When I got to the river, I walked up and down the banks a bit, looking for a log or some boards to cross on. There was nothing, which only made me think of Nikki's warning about avoiding places other people didn't want to be. I scoffed. Maybe that was the best place to be. For once, Nikki didn't know what she was talking about. After a few minutes, I was able to locate a fallen log and slide my way across it carefully. I almost tripped at one point and felt my heart rate increase dreadfully despite how shallow the water below was. I told myself it was just because I didn't want to get my car wet, or bother with washing the car how old Nikki had insisted I get, but something in my head screamed for me to turn back. And I stood in front of the playhouse, and all felt worth it. Despite the peeling paint, chipping wood, and cracked glass, there was an odd and distinct beauty to the old place. It reminded me of a dollhouse I'd had as a kid. I stood there in the woods for a long time, just admiring it before I got up the courage to go closer. I snapped a picture and sent it to Nikki, but there was no cell service. When I finally entered the structure, the first thing I noticed was the simple wooden floor, and how clean it was aside from some dirt and grass and a few small piles of leaves. That may not sound very clean, but if you've been in a lot of abandoned structures, you'll know what I mean. That's not just unusual, it's bizarre. I glanced up and saw that there was a small hatch in the ceiling with a simple rope ladder hanging down. The rope had frayed in the middle on one side, and slightly higher up on the other, so it was cut and dangling. I put one hand on it and tugged, then decided it wasn't sturdy enough to support my body weight. Part of me was kind of proud of myself. Even though I hadn't listened to Nikki, which she asked me not to explore this place, I was still using her safety lessons. I figured if this went well, I could try and convince her to come back with me so she could see the place for herself. I snapped more pictures from the inside. The walls, the ceiling, the broken windows. After a moment, I noticed something in the pile of leaves and walked closer to investigate. It was a child's teacup set, perfectly intact and made from porcelain. I walked towards it like I was in a dream, and when I got there, noticed the wooden slats on the wall leading up to another hatch in the ceiling. I tested them, pushing down with one foot while I braced against the wall. When I told Nikki about it later, she said I should have used my hand, or a stick instead in case the wall collapsed, and when I had to turn, and they were sturdy enough to hold me, I began to climb. When I got to the second floor of the playhouse, I nearly fell back to the ground floor in shock. Propped in one corner was a life-size doll of a man. It had a cloth body and porcelain head and hands. The face looked angry, with painted-on eyebrows and bright pink lips pulled down in a grimace, but the eyes looked more pained or afraid than angry. It was horribly unsettling, and I had to take a few minutes clinging to the wooden slats to catch my breath. After a moment, I realized I was hanging on pieces of rotten wood at least 8 to 10 feet up from the ground, and I scrambled onto the floor. The room was small, probably 6 feet across in either direction, and this room had more detritus in it. I saw scraps of what looked like fancy children's dresses among the wreck from the roof having caved in. I couldn't tell for sure how old the playhouse was, but years of snow, wind, and rain had clearly taken a toll. There were boards and shingles all over the floor, and when I glanced up at the ceiling, I could see only a few structural beams, and only trees and sky beyond that. I looked back down at the floor and felt a little snake of worry wriggling in my stomach. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. I shoved down my worry and kicked out at the crumbling wood beams on the floor, wanting to move them so I could see what was underneath. The smiling face of a little girl looked back at me from under the rubble, and I screamed, stumbling backwards and landing in the lap of the life-size doll. It wrapped its arms around me, and I screamed even harder, then burst into tears of relief when I realized the arms had just fallen on me. I crawled away from the doll and laid on the floor for a moment, alternating between laughing and crying until I felt something touch my ankle. It was a soft touch, So gentle I told myself I could pretend it didn't happen. But my stupid head turned of its own volition, looking down at my own foot almost accusingly. A tiny, soft hand rested gently on my ankle and I allowed my eyes to follow the hand up to the wrist, to the elbow, to the shoulder, and then to the tiny smiling face. I stared at it in horror, trying to process what I was seeing. There in the rubble was a little girl. She was the size of a very small child, and her skin was shiny and white like porcelain, but moved like regular skin. Her hair was pitch black and her eyes were a shiny, happy blue. She stroked my ankle gently and asked, "Do you want to be my friend?" I don't know any other way to say this, but her voice was like porcelain, too delicate, bright, and oddly ethereal. I jerked my ankle away and crawled backwards like a crab, trying to put some distance between us. As soon as I did, her face fell, and for a moment I felt like the world's biggest monster. I said, I just want to go. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be here." Big tears welled up in her eyes as she said, "You don't want to play with me?" I was at a loss. On the one hand, a little girl had just crawled out of the rubble of a broken-down old playhouse in the middle of nowhere and was stroking my ankle like a creepy guy at a bar. On the other hand, apparently all she wanted was someone to play with, and I felt like kind of a massive jerk saying no to such a sweet request. I also felt like a massive fool for feeling bad instead of running away. I edged backwards again and she asked, "Are you scared of me?" She slowly started crawling out of the rubble, revealing an equally doll-like body in strangely pristine pink, white, and blue dress. Instead of crawling towards me, she pulled herself up and walked over to the life-size doll on the floor. She pressed her hand to its cheek lovingly and the doll's eyes flew open, revealing the real human eyes under the painted porcelain-looking ones. I screamed and the doll opened its porcelain mouth as if to scream too, but the girl ripped her hand away and the face went back to a painted porcelain mask. She said, "Daddy was always scared of me though." That was more than I could handle and I threw myself down the open shaft with the rope ladder, giving myself some nasty rope burn as I used it to try and break my fall. I stumbled, fell, and heard a tiny porcelain voice say, "Don't run away. I'll have to make Daddy chase you." I decided to take that bet and sprinted out the door and through the shallow water, not stopping until I got back to my car. I fumbled the keys once, before managing to get them in the door to unlock it, already sobbing in terror and relief as I slid in and locked the door behind me. I looked up to see a little girl holding the hand of the life-size doll, its head rolling limply on its shoulders, and I threw the car in reverse and backed out onto the road. I made it all the way home before I realized my cell was missing. It must have fallen out of my pocket when I ran away from the house. It was only a few hours before Nikki showed up at my house, looking pale and angry. She hugged me tightly and said, "What the hell? Nora, you went back without me." I burst into tears all over again and had to pull myself together to explain what had happened. When I was done, she said, "I don't think I'd be able to believe that story if you didn't look so scared right now. Did you take anything before you went out there?" I shook my head. I was stone cold sober. "Nick." She nodded vaguely, just as her phone buzzed. She held it up to show that the message had come from my old number, the phone I had lost in the woods. I watched as she opened it up and showed me a picture of my car driving away from the playhouse.